All right. So we'll get started in just a minute. We have 150 people registered for this training. So we're gonna wait a minute for things to fill up because I think we're gonna have a pretty good turnout. And I know Shelby did our little reminder. We sent out our confirmation emails again. That's a rave. Yes, we're having a training rave. Woo woo. That'd be pretty amazing. I don't know what a trauma-informed rave would look like, but maybe this is it. My kid has found these wild videos of these like incredible mosh pits in like, I can't even, it makes my trauma-informed brain scared to watch it. It's just like crowds of people running at each other. So this training will hopefully be the opposite of that. All right, so we're getting close. I'm going to give it another minute or two. So just a reminder that, because this question will come up, and if you see the question come up, feel free to respond to it in the chat. After the training, we will be posting the video and the slides. So we're going to post them. We're also going to email them out to everybody. So yes, the materials and the recording will be available after the training, as is the case with all of the trainings that we do. The other thing I'm going to do that remind me, okay, so I have closed captioning on. So if anybody needs it, you can see closed captioning for yourselves. I don't know exactly how to toggle it for you, but I think it might already be showing. We are going to ask folks to stay muted unless you're asking a specific question. And so we may actually, as the powers behind this curtain, mute you. Please take no offense. It's just because we're going to have a ton of people in here and the background noise can be really distracting. I think that's all the housekeeping stuff. Okay, so here we go. Boom. Sorry, Diana, muting you. So with that, I am going to introduce Ariana and Kate. Ariana Saunders and Kate Bitney, they are from Center for Supportive Housing, and they are going to be training us today on trauma-informed care. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to them and mute myself. And they'll talk a little bit about themselves and also sort of how questions and stuff will work during the training. Go for it.
Excellent. Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, thanks, everyone. Good morning. Happy to be here with you all. So yeah, let's just get through little logistics, and we're excited to get started and start talking about trauma-informed care with you all. And very excited to see so many folks joining us. This is just our normal slide about, making sure everybody understands how to use Zoom. We want to feel like it's safe to think that most people are very familiar these days, but just in case not, if you're having issues hearing us, there's those audio settings down at the bottom left, and make sure you use the chat feature. We really are going to encourage this to be as interactive as possible. So we're going to encourage folks to use the chat. We also have a tool called Mentimeter where we'll ask for some feedback and input as well. So really want to encourage you all to do all that. And if you're having any problems, again, feel free to use the chat function or raise your hand. And Kate and I, as well as the CoC team, is on deck to help us and support the background of all of that. So hopefully you'll get all that you need to stay supportive and interaction. Okay, I can't think. Better words will come to me in a second, but to stay involved. That's what I'm thinking of. So a little bit about CSH before we get started. So we are a national nonprofit. We have offices across the country, as well as staff located across the country. For example, I'm joining you out of my home office in Las Vegas, Nevada. And so our goal, our mission is to really help and support communities and programs, create, build, sustain quality supportive housing, because we do see that as a valuable and an evidence-based intervention that is shown to help communities who are in need, who lack resources and the support that we know we all want and need to thrive and live independently with dignity. So we do that through 4 lines of business. We have our training and education, which is what brought Kate and I here today with you. We do a lot of webinars and in-person trainings for folks. We also do some lending. We're a CDFI, so we often support projects that are coming online, that are building or starting up, and provide, sometimes that gap fill funding for folks to make sure that their housing can come and we can start housing folks, because that's our goal. We also do a lot of advocacy at the national and local level when it comes to policy reform. We actually have a policy team in California that I know does a lot of advocacy and support to support all the issues and, overcome some, old policies that we know are creating unnecessary barriers to getting folks housed and off the streets and the services that they need. And then we also do a lot of consulting and technical assistance. So working directly with communities, providers, to again, help folks figure out what's working and how we can add capacity or support them in building or sustaining their housing for folks. So that is CSH in a nutshell. CSH.org has all of our information, and happy to share our contact information if you want to hear more or you have specific follow-up questions for Kate or myself. So speaking of me and Kate, let's introduce ourselves. My name is Ariana Saunders. Feel free to call me Ari too. It's easier to write in the chat, and a lot of folks call me that, and I go by both. I am the associate director for our training center. So I do this quite often. Don't judge me. And also joining you out of my Las Vegas location, I always have to say when I'm ever doing a training for a community that's in California that I am also a California native. Miss it. Seeing the weather behind some of you guys, lovely skies, is making me miss it more. And I've been doing this work for a little over 10 years, specifically around housing and homeless services. I come from direct service mostly. I did do a little bit of time, sounds like I did some time in at the community county level, but mostly have worked directly with folks serving tenants to get them into housing or working with tenants on the streets, and largely at a supervisory or in the admin side of things, mostly doing quality improvement kind of stuff. So, but I've also done direct service and supervised folks that were doing direct service. So very happy to be here, very passionate about this stuff, and excited to share and learn with each other today. So I will hand it over to Kate, who can do a much better job of introducing herself than I.
Well, I don't know about that, but
I
will introduce myself in the ways that come out.
Okay.
Hi, everybody, and thanks, Ari, and Jamie, and everyone there in Contra Costa. My name is Kate Bitney. I also work for the Corporation for Supportive Housing, and I'm located just south of Seattle, Washington, so north of all of you. I am a senior program manager on the Western Region Consulting Team, which means I get to work in areas kind of Colorado on west, and much of my work is in California. So I'm glad to be in community with all of you just virtually today. I've been with CSH almost 4 years and been in the field of quite a long time, long history of direct service background, from intensive case management to street outreach to working in shelters, drop-in centers, done some police provider work. I'm not a police officer, but I've done some community policing sort of relationship building things back where I lived in Minnesota, as well as a number of other things. So just again, really glad to be here today. As a bit of a lead up or just kind of a level setting, I will be going off camera when I'm not speaking today. I've noticed a number of you are off camera, some are on. Just know that today, whatever makes you feel comfortable, whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, that's fine. Like Ari and I have zero expectations of anyone being on camera. On camera doesn't equal engaged, and off camera doesn't equal not engaged. So do whatever you need to do to take care of yourselves today. We're going to be talking about trauma, which can be a bit of a heavy subject sometimes. So again, just feel free to take a breath, take a step away if you need, and any examples that you share, just to kind of reiterate what Ari said a moment ago. Any examples that you share, make sure that they're not too detailed so we don't inadvertently re-traumatize ourselves or others. And if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat, feel free to use the raise hand feature. We can take you off mute, you can speak out loud. We really want to make sure that our time together today works for you. So yeah, ask away. We're excited to learn from you as well. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thanks, Kate. So as Kate said so well, leading into this, we wanted to start off too by just making sure we kind of level set with those expectations. We do, are excited to talk to you about trauma-informed care and really do want to hear from you all. And so as Kate said, we know sometimes that may bring up things or people may share examples that can activate some unpleasant memories or feelings for folks. So always want to reiterate that. But also, as we know, we're entering this space, we just really wanted to set the stage too by getting folks to think about this question. And so we're going to use Mentimeter as our fun little way to answer some of these discussion questions. So I'm going to share a link in the chat. You can use that as a way to get to this first question on our Mentimeter. But we really just want to hear from you all just to kind of ground us and get us thinking about what does a safe space and supportive space look like. This is part of, the goal of what we want to do. And we think about including trauma-informed care, taking a trauma-informed approach to the work. And so would love for us to let's define it for ourselves first. So what does that look like? Or what does that feel like to you? And I'm just gonna share the screen that has that to Mentimeter so you can see it. Thanks, folks have already started putting it in the screen. No judgment. It's absolutely one of them. Also, if you're having trouble, I know some of you are like on the move. So really want to make sure folks can engage. If it's easier to come off mute quickly and say something, or even to put it in the chat, feel free to do that as well. All right, seeing some great stuff. Yeah, empathetic, warm, comfortability, compassionate. Yeah, does somebody want to? Thought I heard someone come off mute.
Good morning, Darlene. I would like to
very inviting.
I would like to say open-mindedness.
Open-mindedness, yeah. No worries, yeah. So Darlene said open-mindedness, and I think that was Marquis. Marquidis, I don't want to mess. I'm butchering your name. I
Yeah,
know, but
Marquidis. Yeah, sorry.
Marquidis, but you
Yes.
said, yeah.
Why is this
Sorry, I'm driving.
No worries.
Very
no worries.
inviting.
Very inviting.
No
Yes.
worries. No worries.
Very inviting. Yes. Thank you.
Trusting.
Trusting. Right. Thank you, LaShondra. Yeah. Oh, you guys, I love this interaction. I don't know about you, Kate, but I've never seen it look so exciting on this with our little Mentimeter.
No, me either. This is amazing.
It's a lot of great words. Using I statements. I'm sorry, that stuck out to me. That's been ingrained in my mind too. Using I statements. Yep. Active listening, acceptance. Oh my gosh, there's so much on here. Wellness, open-hearted, equitable, trusting. This is great. We can also save these results and download them and send them off to you all too. Send them to Jamie to share with you too. We've done this before. People really like this, and then creates a nice little word cloud for you to think about. Reminders. It's all things that we're trying to accomplish, that we want the folks that we're working with, the folks that we're engaging, providing services and housing, right? We want them to feel this too. But I think it's also just important for us to note that this could look different for everybody, right? Some of these words feel similar, but what does it mean to feel warm, or what does welcoming look like? Can look different for all folks, which is also why we really like to use this. And I see folks have put stuff also in the chat, so I appreciate that. Loving, don't assume you know how I feel, inviting, non-judgmental. Yeah, thank you, Sean. Don't talk over me, don't interrupt me. Thank you, Lucille. I like this exercise too. Okay, I'm gonna move back to sharing our PowerPoint, but if you want to continue to share a couple more things, feel free. I'll leave that question up for a second longer. But we wanted to get in and just do some level setting to make sure we're all on the same page as we move into this work and talk about how do we support folks who have experienced trauma, how do we engage them, support them, and create those safe spaces that you all just beautifully described. How do we make that work in the work that you're doing and as you engage folks? And so before we do that, one of the goals of this too is just to get everybody on the same page, so we're talking the same language when we talk about what it means to be trauma informed. And so one thing too is just to get on the same page of what does it mean when we talk about trauma. And so we just wanted to share this as SAMHSA's definition with you all to kind of get on the same page. When we're talking about trauma, specifically, we're talking about, an event. It can be one event or a series of events, or just even circumstances. The environment in which many of us grow up can be a component of it, but it's experienced by the individual both physically and emotionally in a way that's harmful, life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning. And both mental, physical, socio-emotional, and spiritual well-being. And so the way I just take this definition down is just really, it's, what I appreciate is that it really is about what that individual is experiencing and how that impacts them. I think it's important for us to remember that that individual also defines what they interpret as life-threatening or what they interpret as harmful. is really going to be important. But lastly, also, it impacts the whole person, right? It doesn't just impact our mood. It doesn't just impact us psychologically, but we can physically also be impacted by these experiences or an experience of trauma. So really appreciate that. I don't know if there's any initial reactions to that definition. Does this resonate with folks? You can just give me a thumbs up or throw something in the chat, but just wanted to make sure that resonated. Okay. Not too many thumbs down, so I feel like that is a good thing. Also, thank you, Candy. Yes, those a couple thumbs up. Thank you. Also, just want to get on the same page with folks too, and we can use that Mentimeter again. I'm just going to click us over to the next page for that. If you go back to that website or refresh it, hopefully you'll see the next question too, which is asking, why is understanding trauma so important? And thinking about the work that you do day to day, what brought you here today, how you engage folks, what comes up for you folks as far as why do you think it's important? Why did you come today recognizing that you wanted to learn more about trauma-informed care?
Good morning.
Hello.
Hi, for this darling, my camera don't want to work. For me, learning more about trauma for myself as we grow, because we do so much within our community and for our clients and stuff, we forget about ourselves. And then sometimes at the end of the day, you reflect on your job, not knowing that the job that you did that day has an impact on you in some part in your life. And that it triggers sometimes, or sometimes it resonates, or sometimes it just hits different. It hits hard. And for someone that never experienced trauma or had that type of trauma, it hits you different. So getting the feedback and getting the support and getting the information on how to use it, apply it, and what to do with it for not just for our clients, but for ourselves, is very informal for me. To me, I feel it's very informal because when you sit by yourself and beside yourself, looking back at yourself,
Right.
sometimes it hits you like a cannonball.
Yeah.
It does. It hits you. And it's like in a big explosion in your brain. And it's like it can go a lot of different ways in that person, but just learning the tools of getting the information and how to channel it, and having the right support does matter too as well. And all of that is something to gain from this for me. And I appreciate that, because not everybody uses these tools to the best of its advantage, and not everybody. I mean, everybody. It's a given. It's a given.
Right.
It's a given.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. And it's a lot of folks on this Mentimeter, I think, are reiterating a lot of what you're saying too. In fact, the next slide that I'll share, we're going to talk a little bit about secondary trauma. So I appreciate you highlighting that, because it is a big deal. And Kate and I always, when we're doing these types of trainings, like to reiterate exactly that too, darling. So I appreciate you highlighting that, which is that everything that we're going to talk about today, yes, we're going to talk about a lot of examples about how you do this work and support folks that you're, working with and that you're providing services directly to. But we can also do this for ourselves and for each other, because it is hard work. Secondary or vicarious trauma is a real thing, and so I'll share the definition of that in a second. But thank you for highlighting that. And some of what you also said too, with a lot of folks, I think, are reiterating this too, in terms of it helps build empathy. We know it impacts all areas of the life, can help us understand our clients better and how to deliver better quality care. Love that. And just recognizing too, what I'm seeing a lot of these themes here. I'm not going to read every single one, and I can share this again. We'll share this with you folks. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to try to summarize some of this too, where it looks like a lot of it too is recognizing that everybody's experienced trauma, and how it shows up for folks can look differently, but still being sensitive, compassionate, empowering. All these things that I know you all are doing and strive to do regularly is going to be really important in helping them. Not just making sure they can continue to thrive and get the services and the quality services they want and need, but also for you all to make sure you feel supported and protected as well. So appreciate this. Thank you all so much. These are great responses. Enjoying that you guys are so interactive with this. Are you guys seeing the slide again? It says what is
Yes.
the little thing? Okay, just
Yeah.
I switched up
says-
the way I was sharing, but
Oh,
wanted to
there we
make
go.
sure. Yeah.
There's secondary trauma now
Okay.
showing.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. So yeah, to your point, Darlene, and what I think a couple of you also brought up was the idea of secondary trauma. And so as we discuss about this today, we really just want to make sure we also recognize that and kind of highlight the fact that many of us who do this work are going to experience the secondary trauma or vicarious trauma just because of the nature of our work, right? Just because of the nature of sometimes we are having to hear a lot of the trauma and the experiences that folks have had to have as we try to understand them and figure out what their needs are. We may be directly exposed to some trauma. I know, unfortunately, many of us had to deal with that, especially through the pandemic and even before. I unfortunately had many experiences of what it's like to lose a tenant or to see a tenant go through a very serious traumatic experience while you're working with them. That in of itself can be very traumatic. Not to mention, we've all experienced trauma, right? So some of these things may bring up old stuff in our past that we're not aware of. And so recognizing how this constant exposure and the high degree of stress and work that you do can impact it, but also recognizing that many of us get into this work because this is who we are. We're naturally folks that are very giving and want to help. And that also makes us more susceptible to experiencing secondary trauma and some of those and some of the consequences, unfortunately, which is we have to then figure out our own ways to deal with that stress, that exhaustion, and learn how to get ourselves the support and recuperate so we can also make sure our healing is always at the forefront. So just wanted to make sure we always pause and recognize that as well. Oh, and I appreciate two folks are also putting in the chat too. Sorry, I didn't recognize that before, but I do see a lot of you had some great comments in the chat too about why this is so important. So you all have said it beautifully. It's important. We know this is like how we can do the best we can do to help folks get housed, stay housed, and get the services that they need. But we also know it's a great way to make sure we continue to support ourselves and each other through this work and through these ongoing challenging times. So appreciate you all for sharing that. Wanted to also take a moment too, just to lay some foundation and some knowledge for folks too, to really kind of further reiterate that point about how trauma can impact us and in many, many different ways. And one of the most groundbreaking studies to help do that was the ACEs study, or the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. This may sound familiar to many folks. I feel like it's coming up more and more in pop culture, or just more and more in this work, as folks are really understanding how this study has really impacted the work, but really I think brought other sectors that maybe didn't normally understand how trauma could impact them, such as the healthcare and other types of sectors, to recognize how important it is for us to understand what people have been through and how that can impact how they show up, in front of us today, tomorrow, and in the future. And so what this study really did, it was very groundbreaking because it was one of the largest investigations into childhood abuse and neglect. And really looked at it. It was a longitudinal study too, so it really looked at the long-term effects for folks who experience certain, traumatic experiences, such as abuse, neglect, but also other environmental factors. And it basically was able to categorize these different types of trauma or experiences that folks had into those three major categories: abuse, neglect, or household challenges. And even down to even 10 factors, that basically 10 questions that they ask folks. And what they found out is the more you answered yes, meaning yes, you did have that experience in your childhood, the higher, there was a larger association with some risk factors later on in life. It basically indicating that if you had these experiences, and it's all they asked, right? They didn't ask the degree to which, it just yes or no, did you ever experience this? Which I also think is very important to highlight, is that, because again, everything impacts people differently, the way we're genetically made up, as well as all the other things that make us who we are, all the other experiences that make us who we are. one experience can be just as harmful and impactful on somebody as somebody who maybe has had multiple experiences. And so I really appreciate that they only asked once. They only asked if you had it, and the degree to which you experienced that was not as much of a concern as just did you have it. And it still showed that there's a significant impact in how we feel, how we show up, how we think, and how we behave later on in life. And so really, really great study. If you haven't, you can Google it, but we also have on the learner guide that we'll share with you all links to more information on this study. And really, we just wanted to share it because the results really indicate a lot of what we're going to talk about today, which is how these experiences of trauma can impact folks all around, right? Back to that definition of SAMHSA, holistically. And specifically what it showed is that people who did experience some of these traumatic events were more likely to start smoking and drinking heavily later on in life, specifically for women, Black, as well as Native Americans were more likely to experience 4 more kinds of harm during childhood. So we're seeing, disproportionate impact on certain communities, cultures, or identities. Is going to be really important. We're going to share a little bit about how that happens in a second. And then also preventing, these events they did show can reduce some of the problems, or especially some of the illnesses that folks experience later in life, from anything around challenges around their weight, heart disease, as well as depression. So again, your physical, mental, and emotional health absolutely is impacted by some of these experiences. So we wanted to share that to you just because when we generally talk about trauma-informed care, we think it's important to recognize that people experience trauma in different ways, and there's different forms in which we experience trauma. And just like the ACEs study showed, it still is going to impact people. And so really, we want to just always level set to understand how people may be experiencing trauma differently, just to kind of open our minds and hearts to understanding that. But also it can kind of help inform or kind of get us prepared to understand how this person may need support in the future. I will say, as Kate and I will talk about, repeatedly, if we ask for examples, we don't want to get into too much detail, just as we don't need to know specific forms of trauma or every form of trauma that somebody's experienced to understand that they deserve the same empathy, compassion, and patience that we would give anybody else. And so always like to give that caveat as well. And that's also why we like to kind of break down the forms of trauma to get us to recognize that all of these forms of trauma can lead to the same kinds of symptoms and behaviors that you're observing in folks when it comes to somebody trying to understand what it means to heal, recover, and focus on their wellness, which 9 times out of 10 they've not had the opportunity or power or even energy to do, right, because of some of these traumas and experiences. And so we're just going to briefly go over some of these different forms of trauma. Again, we're not going to go into too much detail, but just want to recognize that they're out there, that people can experience them. So if you are working with folks who may have had similar experiences, again, just kind of giving you context into why they may be struggling, why they may have some physical ailments, why they may have a lack of trust, or be suspicious of you, this person who seems so warm and helpful. Might be because they've never experienced that before in their lives, right? So as I work through these different forms of trauma, we wanted to also kind of frame it with an example that we thought permeates through all of the work that we do. And so in the first trauma, and thinking about that, we want to bring up the example of redlining, because what's also really important to understand is these different forms of trauma, it's a way for us to understand and kind of group them, but also recognizing that they're not mutually exclusive categories. People's experiences or people's lives can actually, blend in through these different forms of trauma and have experiences that probably blend into multiple forms of trauma. Again, the label's not as important as just understanding that experience is impacting them. And so how we support them is going to be really important. And we feel like redlining is a great example of that. It is a policy, and it was more of a very systematic impact, or had a very systematic role in terms of deciding where people live, but the consequences of it can blend into these other forms of trauma. So for those that don't know redlining, just to do a quick history, and by quick, I mean like 10 seconds, we can give you more information if you are curious about it. But redlining was essentially that, as it looks right there on that graph, It was essentially, that the folks created several years ago as a way to basically draw red lines around certain districts or certain communities. And it was a policy that was deliberately put in place to exclude people of color from buying homes in certain areas. And so the goal was to keep certain areas explicitly white, as a way to, again, steeped in those old eras of Jim Crow laws, but also as a way to protect those communities from their perspective, protect them, so that they could keep them not only exclusive, but also this is how they maintain higher property values. And then we know this was intentional, but we also know now, years after the fact, that how that kind of policy impacted other communities, because with higher property values, you get higher taxes. With higher taxes, that gives more and more resources being able to distribute directly to those communities, which meant better infrastructure, better roadways, better access to public transportation and other services, as well as better funded and well-resourced schools. And so even education systems were impacted, as well as healthcare, where grocery stores and retail decide to place their own businesses. All of that was impacted by this legacy of redlining, which is why we see probably the many communities that you're working in and that many of us grew up in had those, the opposite, where come from communities where they didn't have as much access to these resources, where schools weren't as well funded. And we know how that impacts folks, and communities. Many of them are still rebuilding and still seeing the effects of redlining. It's no longer, legal. We had the Fair Housing Act that came in and that stops this kind of discriminatory approach to home selling and retail or realty. But as I'm sure many of you experience, it doesn't mean that there's still not some of that discrimination and there's still not a lot of barriers happening that continue to keep some of these communities more exclusive, or just, still seeing how communities are not fairly treated and resourced as much as we would like. Okay, sorry, very quick and dirty. But we want to get to some other stuff, fun stuff with you all today. So I didn't want to spend too much time on the history lesson. But that is a form of trauma, right? Some of these large scale events that have happened in our communities, in our country, is a form of trauma. It's a form of trauma that people experience together, and so it creates a community trauma as well. One of the best examples we can give, unfortunately, in this day and age is the pandemic, right? We all experienced that. We all had to experience the social isolation, the added anxiety, worries, as well as loss that was associated with folks getting sick and losing loved ones and neighbors to this pandemic. But we also see things like war, natural disasters. Most folks think of large scale events, we think of those like natural disasters and huge things that, impact communities upon communities of folks. As I walk through this, again, for the sake of time, I might not do too many pausing, but if you guys can think of examples too that you want to share that we haven't shared, please share one. So if you can think of another example that maybe you've experienced in your community, or that you're seeing folks deal with, that you're serving and working with, feel free to do that as well. Or if you have questions, let us know. Continue to use the chat. But those are just a couple examples. I think of folks, whenever I'm thinking of my family and loved ones in California too, how you're just getting out of that season where we see a lot of wildfires also impacting folks, and how the displacement, the fear, the lack of good oxygen even in the air, all of that impacts large communities of folks. So that's that large scale trauma, if that makes sense. Another very common form of trauma that most people think of too when we think about trauma is that interpersonal trauma. So taking it all the way down to that one-on-one level or two-on-one level. And so those tend to involve events where one other person or maybe a couple other people are causing harm to another individual. So many things that people can think of, or you can think about events that people have had that have caused that harm within yourself or within a relationship. So yeah, perfect example of that too, Candy, is death, right? The loss of a loved one. We have many folks that I know that we work with often that have some kind of form of medical trauma, right? So dealing with a chronic health disease or a terminal disease can cause a lot of trauma as well. Absolutely, Diana, thank you for highlighting that as well. Alcohol consumption or substance use or misuse is also very telling examples or fitting examples of how these traumas fit up. I always struggle with the right word because I don't want to say it's a great example because that sounds like it's a positive thing, but it's a fitting is the new word I'm using today, example of this. Yeah, thank you, Joe. Yeah, even wild turkeys. Yes, we all experience trauma. Mental health, absolutely, Darlene. Thank you for highlighting that. with interpersonal trauma and thinking next to the next couple slides, we want to talk about some historical and systematic trauma. Again, with redlining, thinking about how redlining impacts that. When you think about folks growing up in communities or places with economic instability, that stress, the lack of resources of care, how that can impact folks and can lead to some coping mechanisms that we know are not so great for folks, such as, increased substance use. ACEs study helped highlight that. We also wanted to recognize how another form of interpersonal trauma that many folks experience, especially folks of color or people who come from communities or identities that are not seen as mainstream or are less or more marginalized, is that of microaggressions. And so if you guys will humor us, we like to share a video just to make sure we're all on the same page when we talk about what microaggressions are. But what I appreciate about this video is it does use some humor and visuals to really highlight and demonstrate how they and why they can be so harmful. So I'm going to rely on Kate and Jamie to shout out if you don't hear it, but we tested it earlier, so we should be okay. So this is about a 2-minute video. So I'm going to play that for you guys for a second.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem,
Oh, you're so well spoken.
just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while,
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland?
sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date,
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
going grocery shopping,
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
commuting to work,
So when are you gonna have a baby?
watching TV,
We have to keep the Redskins name. It's part of our culture and history.
or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Do you know John? Give me shopping advice. I love Cher too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every day,
Can I touch your hair?
multiple times a day,
So pretty. Can
Can I
touch
touch
your
it,
hair,
please? Can I please?
is annoying and makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes, which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares?
Just another angry black woman.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try this challenging major.
Ow. My dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
He looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
All right, I see some initial reactions. Let me get my microphone back. To that video. Yeah, I really appreciate that video. It was like a nice treasure hunt gold find that when Kate and I found that. It was a great way to describe it. Yeah, we will make sure you have access to that. We'll share the links. Yes, absolutely. Any other initial reactions, questions about it? You can continue to share your appreciation for it in the chat too. Can't take credit for it other than being a good internet detective and finding it, but yeah. Nope. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. So, and again, we always put this microaggressions or question mark slide up too sometimes, again, to just highlight the fact that, some people hear micro and they hear small aggressions, and it's really more about it's the act, the one comment that is small, but we recognize how microaggressions really can lead to, which is a little, geez, sorry. Hit the wrong thing on my mouse, can lead to this other form of trauma that we also wanted to talk about, which is historical trauma. Really seeing microaggressions as that connection or that a good example or fitting example, I should say, of how some things, experiences can overlap, right? And so it's interpersonal in nature in that it's usually one other person that's saying it, or, being in a meeting where a group of people say something or do something, but it really leads to some of those historical and intergenerational traumas that a lot of folks experience, especially communities of color or people that come from communities that have been historically oppressed, discriminated against, or I just like to say othered in some way, right? And so really making sure that we honor that and recognize that. And I feel like the video, again, does a great job of how that can build up for folks, as an ongoing almost trigger or like way to activate some of those feelings and unfortunate memories that happen. And so that's exactly what historical trauma is too. It's the idea of folks, large groups of individuals, communities who have had experiences or grew up in environments that were very traumatic. We've seen more and more research show how that becomes intergenerational, and that trauma is passed down to folks, and our reactions to those trauma, how we build that resilience or how we define what our responses to that trauma should be, gets taught down to us, right? Over generations. And so example that comes to mind for me just personally, being a biracial woman, Black woman, is recognizing how some of that has played down in my family in terms of just some of the culture that's permeated through our community in terms of how we've responded to slavery, Jim Crow laws, and how some of that still permeates in the Black community today. A lot of things too that I think is relevant too is like many communities, Black communities, other communities of color, have gone through trauma that's medical in nature. Tuskegee experiment, gets thrown around a lot, but there's other examples that we can share. Thinking about the example that Kate has brought to my attention around how birth control was experimented upon in folks in Puerto Rico, how that creates this culture of distrust for folks. And so recognizing how that is intergenerational in nature is going to be important for us to recognize as we engage folks from different cultures or different backgrounds, but also just another example of how that historical trauma can show up. Another example too is systematic trauma. Again, this very much overlaps with historical, even interpersonal trauma. Redlining is another example, very fitting, clear indicator of how this shows up for communities. But this again is more of and it has history and nature to it, but it really is about, how institutions, policies, systems are created to, and that have created atmospheres or created experiences for folks that are also very harmful and traumatic. And so again, something like slavery, something like Jim Crow laws or redlining are examples of that. But I also think of examples such as, our communities that are just coming out of eras that were steeped in homophobia, where marriage equality and those types of rights were not given to folks equally. And so also, there's a million examples, right? I don't want to like reiterate too many, but those are just examples of wanting to highlight how that is. And thank you, Mary, for highlighting, yes, Henrietta Lacks with vaccines. And so just really making sure that we recognize that and how that impacts folks. Again, that's why, even with redlining as the example, we wanted to have the throughput here. That's why we see many of us are working in communities where they don't have access to, quote unquote, healthy food or organic or natural, fresh food. Growing up in communities where you maybe not have access to healthcare regularly, you have to drive an hour to see your doctor or to get to a clinic, a free clinic, recognizing how all of that impacts folks, that stress, those added burdens on people's day-to-day lives, impacts their ability to engage with us, right? Or even trust that we're really there to support them. And then the last, but not least at all by any means, racialized trauma, we also wanted to highlight because it is a form of trauma that is, over the past couple of years for a lot of clear reasons through the media and what our country has been focusing on, but really recognizing how research is also showing that this form of trauma, the consequences, the symptoms and behaviors associated with folks who have experienced this form of trauma very much aligns with what we see through PTSD, which a lot of folks end up struggling with who've experienced any of these other forms of trauma that are on your screen. And again, just wanted to make sure we share that definition, and also just recognize that it is a form of trauma that many of the folks that you all are probably working with have also experienced, as well as us and some of your colleagues. And so recognizing how that distrust, that that harm on our body physically and mentally can show up very much the same way, just like microaggression showed, I think, so well, and how that impacts folks. Okay, so those are the different forms of trauma, and it feels very heavy and depressing. But we wanted to make sure folks understood it, that we set those contexts so we understand that this is how impacting how people show up. But also like to end it with this kind of statement that one of our colleagues, who actually doesn't live so far from you all in Oakland, really wanted to say, really helped kind of contextualize some of this for us too, which is also recognizing that any response to an abnormal event is a normal response. Just like to say that. It always gives me chills sometimes when I say that too. Initial reactions, if you want to like throw something in the chat, like what comes up from you when you hear this statement, and then I'll share what comes up for me or why we like to share this statement, but we'd love to hear from you all first. It's a trigger. Yeah, thank you, JC. Yeah. Historical trauma with Native Americans. Thank you for bringing that up, Robert. Yeah. That's a very good question. I don't know why there is not a month dedicated to that. Yes, thank you. Also validation. That's what comes up for me too, as well as Chris. Yeah, that's I think what gives me chills, because it kind of validates personally some of the things that I've done or said or felt, because it's Kate's gotten this question from me too, probably, but a lot of friends and colleagues get this question from me too and be like, is it me, or is this normal? But this is how I'm feeling, or am I the one that's overreacting? And it just really helps kind of contextualize that for us, because we experience these things and there is no right or wrong way to respond to some of this stuff. So I think it's really important that we recognize that, but also for me, it helps remind myself to get to that place of empathy and compassion, because we can't judge how or why folks are reacting the way they are, especially when we will never fully understand what they've been through, right? Yeah, it's not right for everybody else. It's a natural thing. Yeah. That eruption, that breakdown, right? All emotions are valid. Say that to my kids a lot. All emotions are valid. Now we have to figure out how we work through them and heal, right? So I think that's really important piece of it. Okay, for the sake of time, I'm just going to go through this last bit kind of quickly, because I do want to get to Kate, who's going to share some fabulous strategies. Now that we know all this stuff, we recognize this may be happening with the folks that we're working with, or the folks that we're serving, or maybe ourselves. Want to recognize how we can build some strategies to work through it and support each other and our tenants or clients. But just really quickly too, wanted to also reiterate the fact on how trauma does impact us both physically, but also really understanding how it impacts the way our brains function. And it's really important that we also recognize that. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about the science, biology backside of it. Also not a great, strong suit of mine too. Never did exceedingly well in my science classes. But if I can get it, hopefully you can get it too. And I think really the gist of it is really recognizing that our evolutionarily wise, our brains, our bodies are built to deal with that fight or flight mode, right? We're built to sense danger. We're built to quickly assess the situation and understand if it is dangerous, and then give us those instincts or those learned lessons on how to respond to protect ourselves and our loved ones from that impending danger. And when all of that is happening in our brains, when we're experiencing that fight or flight response, there are like chemicals, hormones, things that are going off in our brain and that are activated that also impact the rest of our body, which is why we start to sweat maybe, and our breathing changes, our heart rate races, right? All of this is being impacted. And we have to remember that folks that grew up with significant trauma, especially that chronic form of trauma where it's very ongoing day-to-day experiences, what happens is our brain starts to get used to dealing in that kind of flight or flight mode, which is a very much panic, heightened state and not supposed to be a long-term state. But for folks who experience that quite often, it does change the way your brain functions, right? It constantly releasing those hormones and those chemicals can really impact the brain. And so what it does is our brain now becomes more of a survival brain than a brain that is a growing, learning, and a brain that can be more focused on wellness, to be quite honest. And so when that does happen, what happens for a lot of folks, just want to highlight two important things for us to recognize is one, people's ability to assess danger can become distorted, right? So that alarm system can become distorted. And what happens is things that may appear normal or neutral or even positive in nature can set some of those alarm bells off for us, right? Because we've been in the survival mode for so long, our brain's ability to sense some of these things has changed or has warped, because it hasn't had the ability to relax and be able to understand some of these new signals that some of us may see as positive or neutral, but for others it can be very much alarming. And so that's where you may see some things that feel like an overreaction, or you may be surprised why some of your regular gestures and engagement techniques are not working for certain people. This is what might be happening. And so we always want to just recognize that, and also highlight to you that it also impacts our ability. The way our brain functions now is also impacted by our ability to, appraise new situations and learn from our experience, right? Because we've been so much in this flight or flight mode, you don't have that cognitive mental space or capacity to really learn and digest things as much as some of the rest of us have had, right? The luxuries that many of us have now that we're in more calm, stable environments. And so recognizing that is also going to be really important. It might be why you see people who continue to make similar decisions that you know are negative, or they've even said are not quote unquote good choices for themselves or their family. But we have to also give them some patience and grace in understanding that their brains are processing this information differently, and may just not even have the ability to kind of focus on these things the way we would love for them to do. The way I like to think about it too is that Maslow's hierarchy of need. We talk a lot about, people hear a lot about that, how our basic needs need to be met, so we can then function on some of these higher needs. It's just another way I think about this too. Folks who've experienced a lot of trauma or who are overcoming trauma, their brains have been so focused on just feeling safe, just understanding where they're going to sleep that night or how they're going to, feed, themselves or their loved ones. They've not had an ability to think about what is a career goal, right? Or what does mental wellness look like for me? I don't have time to think about that. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to, get some food today. So I think it's just important for us to recognize some of that. Okay, enough talking from me. Way too much, actually. I'm going to turn it over to Kate, our fabulous colleague.
Thanks, Ari. And thank you everybody for, as Ari's already mentioned, just such an amazing engaged chat, all the examples that you're sharing in the chat as well. I feel like everybody has something to learn, everybody has something to teach, and I just really appreciate you all like teaching me, right, and sharing so many great examples with myself and your colleagues and just in this space today. So as we start to kind of delve into the next part, like Ari said, kind of the nuts and bolts, if you will, of kind of what is trauma-informed in care, what are trauma-informed approaches. We're going to use another Mentimeter for this question, but wanted to ask, like, as you think about, the people that you've worked with, how has trauma shown up, or what might it look like? So if you go back into that link, and hopefully someone can pop the link in the chat there, and you can hit refresh, and then your answers will show up here. Thank you, Ari. Yes. What has trauma shown up, or what might it look like? You think about like the tenants or clients that you've worked with, and think about some of the examples. Folks were giving some a little bit earlier, I think, in the chat as well. But how has trauma shown up? What are some of the things? Microaggressions, or maybe the experience of microaggressions, perhaps. I don't want to speak for anyone, but maybe committing. Great. I don't want to speak for, but microaggressions in some way. Got it. Crying. Yep. Arguments in a meeting. Yep. Emotional anger. Yep. An immigration journey. Yep. Absolutely. Yelling, shutting down, isolating, crying. Yep. Not showing up to work. Yeah, absolutely. Victim mentality, alternate reality story, apathy, perhaps violence. Yep. Substance use, anger, lack of patience. Oh, that's a big one. I can resonate with that. Lack of patience for myself. Yep, that's how it could show up for me. I see there's some more further down on the screen as well. Thanks, Ari. Lack of focus. Yep. Communicate, disrespect, trust issues. Yep. Taking mental health days. And that's an interesting one too, right? Because it might result in taking more mental health days. And I think it's awesome that people do take mental health days in recognition of like, hey, this is happening for me, and kind of that self-awareness factor of like, I need to do this to take care of myself. So just want to make that quick distinction, because I think it's really important that folks have that space and that like permission, like explicit and implicit, to take those. Yeah. Not getting the job done. Yep. Missing details, resistance to, that's one of my least favorite terms, that service resistance, right? Yep. Lots of absences, but work not getting accomplished. And yes, for the declining housing or fear to accept help. Yeah, I think about like, and we'll talk about that kind of as an example in just a moment, actually, but I'm going to go through with the principles where kind of that fallacy we hear about people not wanting housing, right? And kind of the reasons why. So I appreciate that you listed that example. Yep, insight, judgment, pretending things are okay, difficulty communicating. Yeah. These are amazing examples. Are illustrative examples. I really appreciate you sharing these. Yep. Argumentative. Great. Okay. Well, feel free to keep sharing these in chat. I'm going to hop away from this screen. Let me, or my behind the scenes work there. There we go. Okay. Hopefully folks are able to see my screen. So in terms of how folks might feel when experiencing trauma and how it might show up, right? I think all the examples you gave were amazing. So I'm not going to like belabor a lot of these points, but I think a lot of what you all shared, right, is coming up in some of the kind of the top 5, if you will, that we kind of listed here. So sense of isolation or disconnected, feeling like you're the only one this has ever happened to, or you're really isolating as part of that too, right? Might experience feelings of helplessness or powerlessness, changes in a person's worldview, and that loss of safety or trust. And that shame, blame, guilt, and stigma as well. Stigma is such a powerful thing, and it's really, really strong when it comes to all kinds of things in our lives, right? Oh yes, and Patricia, dissociation as well. It might show up in that way. Yep. Fear. I think about that lashing out that Sean and others mentioned, that feeling argumentative with folks. Yeah, absolutely. So as we think about, we've talked about some of the different things that and how it might show up. Why don't you just name a few examples of, what are some things that might re-traumatize, clients, tenants, staff, ourselves, since we've talked about the effects of trauma. Wanted to bring up some of these sorts of things. So thinking about what are the things that might re-traumatize folks. So it might be thinking about some of the things that tenants who've maybe had a reaction that seemed a little bit out of the blue, perhaps to you. But again, going back to what someone said earlier, a few someones, I think, around never assuming what people are experiencing or their reactions, right? Being trauma informed, right? So here's a few activating events we wanted to list. So one, triggers of being reminded by of living in the homelessness system. So many folks who live in supportive housing have had experiences of living in a variety of different systems. Some that I can think of are foster care, the justice system, institutions, shelters, and a lot of those experiences the folks have been through have been very traumatizing. So thinking about those, reminders of a past abuser as well. So in addition to those kind of systems experiences that folks may have had, it's important to be sensitive to the fact that folks you're working with might be triggered by like a color of clothing or a particular time of year or a scent or a type of food, because it may remind them of someone who has abused them, right? Might be triggers of systemic racism as well. I think Ari gave such a great explanation earlier of racism and how that affects all those microaggressions and racialized trauma and how that can affect folks. It's really, really huge. And then thinking through as well around veterans, and that could be triggers of time in combat or in conflict, thinking about things like fireworks, just a few examples. I'm going to go through some of these examples here that are sharing in chat. Yes, having to retell a person's story to providers, absolutely. Oh yeah, thank you, Nicholas. Yeah, if you want to share that link, that would be wonderful. Yeah, denying a bathroom to traumatized senior. Yeah, thank you for all these examples who lived through segregation. Such powerful examples, right? And again, not back to like the importance of not assuming what a person's reaction might be about, but being trauma informed. So let's say we're going to go through the principles of trauma informed care in just a moment, but wanted to think through like in the moment. Let's say something comes up and you witness what you think might be a trauma response, right? How do you address signals of that sort or triggers or activated events that might be leading to traumatization? So just a few things. So first thing we think about is, being sensitive. Again, increase your awareness, really paying attention to those sorts of details. I can think of a client that I worked with years ago who'd experienced a lot of abuse during his time in prison. And I knew that he was for me, I knew he was having a really especially tough time because he would isolate himself and he would really immerse himself, in really triggering activities. So one particular day I went to his house for a visit and he seemed a little off, right, in the ways of when he was well, that wouldn't be common for when he was well. And I saw a copy of the Shawshank Redemption sitting near his TV. So, I checked in and said, hey, how many times have you watched that in the last, few days? And he kind of got quiet and was surprised by my question. And then he answered he'd been watching it just over and over on repeat, right? So I asked if he wanted to talk about that, and he shared, he shared a little bit about what had come up for him recently. We talked through his feelings, what was happening, also his responses. I love that. Yes, Mary, actively listening. Exactly. Yep. Letting somebody talk, right? So for those that aren't familiar with this movie, if you haven't seen The Shawshank Redemption, it contains a lot of fairly graphic examples about interpersonal violence in a prison system. So again, addressing it, talking about it, which kind of segues to the next point, right? Which is helping people to address their triggers, helping people address the activating events. So in the case of this particular gentleman, how do we pardon me, in the case of this particular gentleman, we agreed in that moment, what he wanted me to do was for me to take the movie with me. He's like, I'm going to keep watching this if this is there. Can you just take that really like in my face trigger away? Yep, absolutely. And then we talked through strategies for addressing what was going on for him in the moment, kind of as a response, right? And reminding, as Candy said, reminding him to be in the moment. How can we work through that? And then the final one too is really, again, recognizing that we can't avoid triggers altogether. Life happens, things come up, but really it's important to help ourselves as well as other folks to kind of live with triggers as much as we can and really develop those coping skills, really kind of reduce the fear response from happening as much as we can, really helping folks to find things that can help them be in the moment and really help them to feel safe in that moment. So as we think about that too, and all these different examples, perhaps things that are coming up for you, wanted to ask the question, as we're about to delve into trauma-informed care, what are some of the ways that you like to be treated that make you feel comfortable? How do you do that? What makes you feel grounded, kind of living in the moment, if you will, as Candy mentioned? What are some things? And if you want to share your answer in chat. Providing resources, yeah. Simple thank yous, yeah. Kindness. Validation, yep. Thank you, Michael. Any others folks can think of? What are some things that, and again, there's no right or wrong, no gotcha answers. Respect, yep, appreciation, kindness, being worthy, asking how you're doing. Yep, somebody really listening to you. Yep. Politeness, honesty. The chat here. Smiles, yep, checking in, honesty, active listening, giving that positive feedback, right? Absolutely, I'm big on positive feedback as well. Thanks for that, Denise. Return the greetings, feeling understood, encouragement, empathy, appreciation, that mutual respect. I like that kindness and mutual respect. So between two people, it's that relationship, like feeling heard, yep. Being encouraged, yep. These are great. Well, feel free to keep sharing more examples in chat. I'm thinking back as well to like what Ari asked earlier around, what helps you to feel safe and supported, right, in a space. Reflecting on some of those examples in my mind as you're sharing more examples in the chat as well. Being inspired, yeah. So as we think about, all these examples that were just given, and maybe others that are going through your mind that you perhaps haven't shared, which is just fine, wanted to share one of many definitions of trauma-informed care, and that's which is from SAMHSA. So SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, which has a lot of great and many free resources on trauma-informed care. So they state that trauma-informed care is the adoption of principles and practices that promote a culture of safety, empowerment, and healing, which I really think sums up a lot of what you all said really in this definition. And as we think about that approach as well, they say that their concept of a trauma-informed approach is that a program, organization, or a system that is trauma-informed does four things. One is that it realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery. It recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved with the system. It responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and then seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. So again, trauma-informed care, really to kind of sum it up into bite-sized pieces, is often described as a shift in really moving or asking or shift in thinking, what's wrong with you over to what happened to you, or even more simply, what happened. So that's kind of the shift that we're going to be talking through, and the lens through which we're going to be talking through things today. I'm seeing there's a large comment in chat, which is great. I am going to keep moving through, and hopefully, are you able to respond to that? I haven't had a chance to read it. I apologize. So I'm not ignoring your comment, Nicholas. All right. So again, we're going to go through, talk about SAMHSA's approaches, and in order to do that, I wanted to share a story about a gentleman I used to work with. This story is about a gentleman named Joe, although that wasn't his real name, but he was a real person. And the scenario on the screen that I have in front of you is something that really did happen in my work with Joe. So I wanted you to share this scenario and have you keep the scenario in mind as I walk through the 6 different principles of trauma-informed care in just a moment. Or if you prefer, maybe you want to think about somebody else that you're working with that's coming to mind for you, and how you might reflect on that. And then we'll revisit the slide at the end as well to see if anything kind of came up for you as we were going through. So first one, let me just Pause real quick. Okay, great. Oops, sorry. I apologize. I didn't read Joe's story. I just talked about Joe. Joe was a 70-year-old man, and he had been living out at the time that I met him. And he'd been living outside and in shelters for the last 30-some years, over 30 years. And he'd recently been assigned to your caseload. In this instance, for me, he had been recently assigned to my caseload. He'd been institutionalized for over 10 years in a mental health institution when he was younger. And he states that he's safer sleeping on the streets, but he's also in need of a major surgery. And Joe is unable to kind of undergo the surgery until he has a safe place and stable place to recover. So you found a permanent housing option for Joe, but Joe has told you that he's afraid to move inside because he's afraid that he's going to be locked up again. So I'm going to walk through kind of the principles of trauma-informed care using this, but just any initial responses or ideas that come to mind for Joe, or how you might approach your work with Joe before I move on to the principles. Any thoughts on what you might do, things you might ask, things you might say or think about? Validate, 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 100%. Thanks, Denise. Yeah, exactly. His experiences are real, and his response to those experiences are real, just like Ari said earlier. Emotions are valid. Any other thoughts on what you might do or things you might think about? Again, I'm going to go through and share what happens, so this isn't a gotcha question. Wanted to see if anything comes to mind for folks. Give folks about 30 seconds to respond, just in case. Ask for some possible solutions. Great. Yep. Yeah. Check in with him. What does Joe want? Yep. Assure him that a stable place would offer him a place to heal after surgery. Yep. Absolutely. Thanks for that, Alicia. Great. All right. Well, I'll go through and I'll share a bit of what the work that I did with Joe and the work that Joe did for himself too, right? And then we'll talk through maybe some examples that might come up for you all as well. As well, Candy, yes, assure him he's not going to be locked up. Exactly. Yep. Because he had been, right? It was a very real threat to him. So safety, first principle of trauma-informed care. Really important to keep this in mind. And not just physical safety, which is important, but also emotional safety. Again, thinking about Joe and Joe's situation, thinking about how might Joe be thinking about a safe and supportive space? What might that look like for him? How can you help to make that real for Joe? What are the things you need to know and the ways that you can support that and make it happen? So as I think about Joe and his feeling safer outside, I really think about the safety kind of in what's known versus unknown. From my point of view, again, my lens, Joe would be far safer inside, right? You know, it's warm, it's dry, it didn't cause him to carry his stuff all over and make his medical situation worse. And in fact, it allowed a place for him to have his medical situation addressed and be able to recover. So that's my perspective, right? As not Joe and the person in need of this surgery and this care. So thinking about it from Joe's point of view and from a trauma-informed lens, what had happened to Joe the last time that Joe was inside, which was also likely probably deemed a place that was safe and warm. He was put there against his will, and he had been held there for over 10 years. He wasn't allowed to leave. I can't even imagine the experiences that he likely had and the things that he witnessed that were in that place, right? Context is really important. So when I think about that, I was thinking about safety initially from my lens, but that's not what's important here. It's essential to think of it from Joe's lens. And simply telling him, hey, don't worry, it's going to be safer inside, certainly isn't a message that could be well received and absolutely wouldn't be trauma informed, past informed present. Yes, Judith, yep, ask him what he would need to help him be there comfortably, right? Yep, maybe shared housing if he's interested. Yeah, I love these examples. Yep, great. So that kind of leads into the next principle, which is trustworthiness and transparency. So again, people feel safe when they know what to expect, as well as that people are going to follow through. So thinking about how many times the folks that you're working with, perhaps I imagine likely yourself as well. I know I have been, sometimes folks have been let down, which is probably a lot. So really working to create that atmosphere of trustworthiness and transparency, utilizing that unconditional positive regard so that the folks that we're working with can trust us, right? That we earn that trust. There aren't any gotcha moments that are going to come up. So thinking again about Joe, how can we help to create that trustworthiness and transparency for him? So for starters, I always followed through on what I said I was going to do. And also always let Joe that he is the one in charge of making decisions, right? Nobody's going to force him to live inside. He's the only one that could make that choice. I brought him to a supportive housing location and showed him the room that would be his if he wanted it. He visited this particular location a number of times and had even stayed at the location for dinner and just interacted with folks. For me, I was really lucky as a service provider that this is the location where my office was. And as an outreach worker, I was allowed, which I was at the time, that was my role. I was allowed to bring folks by that didn't live in that particular location so they could, use the laundry, take a shower, those sorts of things, receive practical services and access to various services. So with that, I let Joe kind of, again, see the room, showed him the key that would be his, again, if he decided to move in, showed him how the door locked, let him know that he would be the only one aside from staff that would have a key, that nobody could ever lock him in, that there were very particular circumstances, if you will, as to how anybody would ever even enter his room. It'd have to be real specific, but let him know that. And he got to meet other staff too, right? As well as the residents who might become his future housemates if he decided to move in there. And we talked through every scenario that he wanted to know about, back to someone's comments about, validate, validate, validate. And Candy, I see your comment too about letting him actually go and see it before he moves in. 100%. What if he decided to move out? These are some of the questions we asked about. What if he mistakenly didn't follow the lease or self-sabotaged and decided not to follow the lease? What if he didn't like it? What if he didn't get along with another resident? So many different things that were really important questions to Joe. So we also talked about what would happen if he chose not to move into housing. So for that, I brought in our outreach nurse that he had known for a long time. And for many of these different conversations, she was part of that because we talked about his medical situation and his medical condition as well. I let him know that I'm going to continue working with him no matter what. This wasn't an ultimatum that we were presenting him with. And I wasn't going anywhere, right? He's the one that got to choose where we do our work together and then what we'd focus on. So as I think about this too, and again, building this trustworthiness, it really took time and it also took a lot of patience. I had to check myself quite a bit at different times and remember that, no matter how many times I got frustrated or tired answering all these different questions that might seem obvious to me or perhaps to a few other people, these were not obvious questions to Joe. And his trauma and his fear was very, very real. He was the one in this situation, right, making these decisions. So he was the one who deserved to really know what he was potentially getting himself into, because it's a really big and life-changing decision for him. So with that too, think a lot about peer support, which is the third principle of trauma-informed care. And this is really, really critical for everyone, and particularly the folks that we're working with who've experienced homelessness before, as well as for service providers, right? So peers not only start with a foot in the door, as well as connecting to folks and building rapport, peers can also offer something that's really, really crucial to everyone's recovery, which is hope, right? So seeing a peer thrive, I feel can be the best way to really illustrate to someone what can be in store for them. Having someone ask questions to someone else who's living there. You got to meet other tenants, other residents, and say hey, Kate said this particular thing. You're a person living here. What was that like for you from this particular lens? So it really honors that lived experience for the unique and special value that it really brings to the table. So again, Joe, peer support was a really interesting one. He stayed to himself a lot. He didn't have a lot of interaction with people. Joe had some cognitive delays in his youth, and actually in his adulthood, he'd been made fun of quite a bit. So it took him a really long time to trust people, which was very understandable. So one of the biggest things for him was meeting people again that lived there, talking with them, observing them, spending time at the dinner table, deciding if this is the place that he could feel comfortable in. And once he decided that and thought about that too, it really helped him to make that decision. Because again, I had shared and talked through many things from my perspective, but I'm not the one that's going to be living there. So my perspective was limited on what I could offer. So the fourth principle of trauma-informed care is collaboration and mutuality. So this one is really about kind of walking side by side with someone. It could be figuratively, it could be perhaps literally, and really thinking through keeping somebody's goals, the person you're working with, their goals at the forefront, because they are the ones that get to make the decision. We all get to be the person in charge of our own lives. And I'm seeing in chat too, peer support is so important. I agree, Wayne. Yes, Ari, I see. I already said that. Yeah, it's critical, right? Peers need to be, and folks with lived experience really need to be leading all of this work that all of us are doing all the time for all the reasons just mentioned, and certainly many more that weren't mentioned, right? Like having that perspective, that's critical to really making change and making systems and programs and everything that will work for folks and making things really individualized as part of that. So yes, thank you for that comment, Wayne. So thinking through collaboration and mutuality and kind of what that looked like for Joe, this was really huge for him because remember, moving into housing or not was his decision to make. That's not my decision, it's his. So I had to make sure that he was an active participant in making this decision. And this really required power sharing. So, we collaborated together to think through this decision. Even though the decision, of course, ultimately was up to him, we brought in folks like the outreach nurse to help think through things from a medical perspective. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Joe had been institutionalized when he was younger, which had a huge impact on his life. And the decision to institutionalize him or not was not something he got to participate in. There was no mutuality present whatsoever. So really putting that power back in Joe's hands, building that trust and that rapport was really, really essential in my work with Joe. And then the fifth key principle is empowerment, voice, and choice. Let's see, Robert. Oh, yes, Robert, that's great. We did end up doing that. I love this example. Yes, so Robert mentioned we could talk with the hospital social worker about how to help him while he was at the hospital. Yes, we did a lot of that collaboration as well. That's a great one. So thinking about, voice and choice and empowerment. So everybody wants choices. And I think as much as anyone is able to, and particularly in the helping profession within social services, it's very, very important to be able to provide choices, as many as possible, to those that we work with. There's always choices, right? And a lot of times folks haven't had a chance to have a say in what happens to them. And that could be anything from where they sleep, perhaps where they eat, their clothing options that are available, sometimes even what happens to their bodies, right? People have had choice and agency taken away. So making sure we infuse that back and keep it at the forefront of the work that we do and that happens is really, really critical. So thinking about, this with regard to Joe, really, really key. Much of his agency had been taken away from him when he was institutionalized as well as ongoing. Much of it came to where he laid his head, or I should say when it came to where he laid his head, the only choice that Joe truly felt in charge of was sleeping inside. And that was really important to acknowledge for Joe. As a related side note, and someone, I'm blanking on the name, but somebody had referred to this earlier, right? At the very beginning of our time together today. In terms of when folks say that they choose homelessness, right? I always say when I hear that particular kind of old trope, if you will, that when you have no or little agency or control in your life, and on top of that have really experienced a lot of trauma, choosing to lay your head in a place that feels predictable to you can sometimes feel safer than sleeping indoors and at the whim of other people. I think this is especially true when it comes to staying in shelters or congregate settings. Getting distance is nearly impossible in places like that. And if a person is worried about not being able to follow a rule or that they might be surprised by something, I think it's very much human nature to want to beat somebody to the punch, if you will, right? And take charge of one's own decisions. Say like, you know what? I'm going to make this my own choice. My own choice is not to put myself in that situation in the first place. I prefer the familiar to the unknown. So, again, when folks are empowered to use their voice and make choices, offered real choices, and given the time and space necessary to make them, as well as the support, can really lead to positive outcomes. So again, thinking back to Joe, he'd been offered housing multiple times before, but he hadn't taken it because he was really afraid for very, very legitimate reasons. As we talked about earlier, everybody is the expert in their own life. The decisions Joe makes had to make sense for him. So offering him choices, hearing him out, allowed him to make the choice that not only felt best for him, but also provided him with dignity. So wanted to note on this one as well that this principle can sometimes feel a little bit overwhelming to participants or clients, but also to staff, right? To those of us working in the field. A lot of service providers have a lot of different rules and regulations to abide by, but most, if not really all of the time, we can make adjustments so that we can kind of achieve the same end goal, right? By using a more trauma-informed path by doing that. So it can be easy to get, I think, impatient with this one in case that's coming up for you. That's come up for me, for myself before. But again, that's a good time to kind of check oneself and do that kind of self-awareness scan of like, it's not about you, it's about the person you're working with. So taking a pause to really be able to provide those choices. If you have an intake, for example, like if it's something that tends to take an hour, can you break it down kind of into 3 different chunks? You know, if somebody's not sure, such as in the case of Joe, if they want to move inside, can you take a few different sessions to go and show them the place they might be living, give them time to make that decision, not make it a rushed thing, not a ultimatum sort of situation? Can they be in charge of where you meet and decide to where you want to talk about the paperwork or the process? Can they choose that? Little choices, right? That can sometimes even be the biggest thing when it comes to choices. So just really that empowerment piece. Yes, and John, yes, liaising with other workers he's worked with before and that he trusts. Yep, outreach nurse absolutely was great. Yeah, and we also, I should add as well, just to add on to your comment, he had an incredible doctor that he worked with, who was very person-centered. He really, really trusted. He was a community doctor that he had known for years. Coincidentally, the doctor's, his wife was the executive director of a local community center where Joe felt safe going to. So again, that same connection, like you said, liaising with other workers, like he had different people in common, and being able to have people he trusted that knew each other was a really, really big deal for Joe. So yeah, thank you for adding that. So the 6th and final principle here that we're going to talk about, and it's part of the SAMHSA 6 principles, is culture, history, and gender. So again, you know, thinking back to the exercise that Ari facilitated earlier around what helps a person to feel safe and supported, you know, thinking about how many of you had something that was related to perhaps any of these descriptions or these subjects in your description, or what you may have been thinking about. You know, culture, gender identity, kind of what happens in our past really shapes who we are, right? And it's important to be sensitive to these things, but also not assume, right? And incorporate them so that people can feel comfortable and safe. So, you know, the culture that somebody comes from might influence how they ask for help, if they'll ask for help at all, the language or perhaps the words that someone uses or how they express themselves, thinking about things like family structure, individualism, or group coping structures, all those sorts of things, and they're dynamic. So they change continually and they can be influenced by people's beliefs as well as the different demands of their environment, both past and present. So thinking back to Joe, wanting to take that history into account with his institutionalism at a very young age. This was during a time in history when one could be locked up for, they called it being feeble-minded, which is the reason that they gave Joe, why he was locked up. That was the phrase he was given. And that had a really profound impact on Joe's life. I'm thinking as well about racial trauma and structural racism and health inequities that Ari shared earlier. Again, thinking about the things that need to be at the forefront of our minds. That might not be obvious on the surface or when we meet someone, but just things that we need to be thinking about, right? That what happened, or how can I come at this from a place of being trauma informed? If you aren't from a culture or a group or an individual that's had a particular experience, it's still important to educate yourselves about things that have happened throughout history, which is a balance because, you know, reading about something is certainly not the same as experiencing something or knowing what it might be like to have that experience. And also not everybody from a particular group may have experienced the same thing. Back to what folks have shared about not assuming, right? You can't assume. That might all sound like a really tall order, but that's where cultural humility comes in as well, which is kind of the last piece I wanted to share here with folks as we kind of finalize and round out this principle. I'm curious if folks have heard of this term before. It was newer to me in the last number of years. And again, this isn't a gotcha question. I'm just curious if this is something that has been brought forward. We'll share info in the learner guide, but is cultural humility a term? Yes. Oh, great. Thank you, Mary. So cultural humility, it's different than cultural competency, right? Ah, great. Thanks, Lucille. I loved it too. When the first time I heard it, I'm like, ooh, I really resonate with this. So it's a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique whereby the individual not only learns about another's culture, but one starts with an examination of their own beliefs and cultural identities. So this is different than cultural competency, right? Cultural competency tends to be kind of a tool for leveling, and they say like imbalanced patient-provider power dynamics. But when we think about this, I think about like white dominant culture in particular, right? When it comes to defining these competencies, researchers have found that whiteness is often understood and really represented as the norm, if you will, which really leads to othering. So it's really, cultural humility is really about learning about another person's culture, cultural competency is more about learning about another person's culture versus reflecting on one's own background and culture and how it might impact one's beliefs and experiences, the latter of which is more around culture and humility. So it's not necessarily that one is like cultural competency is bad and cultural humility is good, both can exist. But I do firmly believe that change really starts within and with one's own awareness. And I like that, yes, Robert, I like that cultural humility really provides a framework for that, because when practicing it, it's really important to approach things with curiosity and also be willing to admit when we make a mistake, perhaps cause unintentional harm, intent versus impact, thinking about exploring your own bias as well, and really practicing cultural humility also involves an ongoing process, again, of that self-reflection and examination, which I really love. So, all right, so back to Joe's story. And then we're going to have a lot of time for questions. I know in kind of preparing for our time together today, we wanted to make sure we left time for questions or to strategize. So I wanted to note that as well. But back to Joe's story before we can dive into questions and a few other things. Wanted to see if there was anything that came up for you around Joe. I think you've shared a lot of really great examples and ideas of what you might have done, suggestions I wish I would have taken up on and thought of in that moment. But anything else that came up around Joe's story or anything you want to add, and that can be in chat, that can be out loud, however you'd like to share. And I love the comments coming through in chat. Yes, healing is at the beginning of healing, race relations. Yeah. Oh, Robert, thank you for that question. Oh, Joe was one of my favorite people. Joe passed away a number of years ago. But I will say that when Joe ended up moving inside, so he went through that process that I described to you, and he did decide that he wanted to move in. He's like, okay, I'll give it a shot. He had the medical condition that he had was an inguinal hernia, which the more that he would walk, carry his stuff, all those sorts of things, like the worse and worse it got. And it was really quite bad. So he said, okay, I'm going to move inside. He was very hesitant. And I used kind of my best outreach trick, if you will, of saying, you know what, Joe, I should call it trick, but my strategy, because it was true, right? Because again, he got to decide if he stayed inside or not. But I said, you know what, if it helps, you could consider this housing to be like a storage unit. Sleep there, but you could, or just store your stuff there. You could still sleep inside while you get used to it. You don't have to stay there permanently. You can set up, I've heard of some people where they like set up a tent inside their apartment, all those sorts of things. So Joe said, okay, I'm going to move inside. I'm going to give it a shot. So we set up very strategically where he wasn't going to have his surgery like immediately when he moved inside, or signed the lease, I guess, because we didn't know if he'd want to sleep inside, right? Like he was, again, going to treat it as a storage unit. So that was what he wanted to do up front. So he moved his stuff in. And for the first, I think like 2 weeks, he slept outside solid, and he would only come inside to like take a shower, to eat meals, things like that. And kind of over time, he tapered into like staying at the place more than sleeping outside. And then eventually he said, you know what, a month or 2 months, he said, okay, I feel safe enough here that I will stay here at least through my surgery recovery. I will sleep inside. Great. Scheduled the surgery, ended up having his surgery. And then he was there, and the outreach nurse came to change his dressings, talk with him about any complications that might come up. We were able to get him to his medical appointments. And then kind of through that process, he decided he wanted to sleep inside and he wanted to stay there, and he didn't want to move outside at all. He decided that this was his preferred option. So yeah, he stayed there for a number of years, very, very successfully. And then as he got a little bit older, because again, he was 70 at the time that I started working with him, he ended up having some more advanced care needs where he needed to have more supportive housing. Sorry, not supportive housing, more support within his housing. What is the word I'm looking for? Like an advanced level of care. So he ended up going to a nursing home where one could also consume alcohol on site as well. And which was great because I don't know that I mentioned that Joe using substances was a big thing for him. He drank alcohol, and again, that was part of accepting Joe for who he was. He's like, I have no desire to quit. This is my thing I want to do. We're like, okay, that works for you. Educated, gave him options on like how much and what that might look like in case this started to interfere with his recovery or his life, but he got to make that decision. So yeah, he moved into a supportive, like a nursing home. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the exact term, moved into a nursing home, and that's where he lived out the remainder of his days with respect and with dignity. And this was back in Minnesota, and I got to see him. His doctor actually got a hold of me because I'd moved out to Washington at the time and told me kind of what was going on. His health was declining a little bit. So I was able to see him one last time before he passed away, which was really wonderful. But I think about just the dignity of the work that all of you do and the great examples. It might have been board and care, Jamie. That's a good question. And yes, exactly, Robert, harm reduction, right? I just think about the dignity that's provided by just providing opportunity for somebody to sleep inside and giving that true option for what a place inside that feels safe with dignity looks like. And yes, Christina, absolutely. Like, it needs to be client-centered, because Joe had been offered housing a zillion times prior to my working with him, but it was either ultimatum type stuff, or you have to stop consuming alcohol in order to work here, or very kind of punitive focused, where this is what the lease looks like and you better abide by it. And nobody, I don't think, likes really threatening sorts of language, at least I don't. And he also had some cognitive challenges, so he was worried about, like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do these things. Like, what does the support look like for me so I can be successful here? So yeah, really, yeah, that was Joe's story. So all right, so with that, and I see this is already starting to come up a little bit in chat, but wanted to talk through, like, does anybody have any strategies or ideas that came up for you that you'd like to try? Or I see some examples coming through. If anybody has something they'd like to share. I see Ari's on camera as well, so maybe you have something you wanted to share.
Here to receive all the great examples. That's what I'm here for. Okay. This is a great chat.
And Jamie's lifting as well that you'll have a free harm reduction training series. Oh,
Yeah,
from the Harm Reduction Coalition. Wonderful. They do great work. Thanks, Jamie. I see Candy shared an example of a person they worked with who would sleep on the floor next to his bed for a while. Yep, about a month or so. Yep, kind of having to retrain himself. Yeah, one thing I will sometimes say is, like, as long as it might take an individual to get into to be experiencing homelessness, it might take that long to come out of it, right? It's not an overnight flip the switch sort of thing at all. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's such a common experience. I had a client, a tenant similarly, who refused to sleep on the bed, and it makes me think of a project in Denver where they created an outdoor space specifically for that, because they knew folks would want to maybe sleep outdoor before they slowly transitioned indoors. So
yeah,
love that trauma-informed approach to design. Is seeing more and more, which makes me excited too.
Thanks for the comments in chat too. I was sorry to hear his passing too, but also, like, he died safe and warm and feeling safe, not only being, but feeling safe in a place where people loved and respected him, which was a really big deal. Yes, normalizing transitions. Yeah, that's true. Any other things that are coming up for folks around, like, strategies or ideas that you might want to try, or things that we've got? I know we've got a couple more things, but we also, again, really intentionally built in time for a lot of, like, questions and talking through things. So are there any scenarios that you might be struggling with that you want to work through?
I
Yeah,
have
Jamie,
one thing I'm
please.
just thinking about. So as we're having this conversation, one of the things I've been thinking about, and actually back chatting with Shelby, thinking about our upcoming trainings, is maybe figuring out a de-escalation training. Like, what do you do when you have somebody whose trauma is really up?
Yep.
Right.
What are the skills you need to be able to respond to that? Like, we can say, like, be empathetic, but, like, what does that look like? What are the words you would use? What are the things that you might want to do or not do to support somebody while they're traumatized, and not have an even bigger blow up? So thinking about, I don't know if agencies are having their own de-escalations trainings, but that's something that I was just thinking about as we're listening.
Yeah.
So
I feel like this is where I should, like, slip you a 20. No, just kidding.
I know. Yeah, I was gonna say, it almost feels like we planted that with Jamie.
Yeah. We're chuckling. Larry and I are chuckling. We do a de-escalation training, talking about a lot of things. We've done them in person, and we've also done them virtually. And it was really in response to exactly what the examples and scenarios that you just described, because it comes up all the time. And I agree, Wayne, it is so important to what all of us do. There's an agency we were working with, and we had them like kind of survey the agency and say like, who would it be most important? Who is de-escalation for? Like, who needs de-escalation? Response was everyone, because we need to
Totally.
de-escalate. Folks working with
Everyone.
each other, ourselves. I went off on a tangent. Your question though around like the words to say, I see too around Candy saying, how do you stop yourself from being triggered when you're working with a traumatized person?
Mm.
I love Robert's comments too around like just listen, be a witness. Yeah, we have an entire piece we do on that. I'm trying to think of some specific examples or strategies in the time that we have now. Talk about like patience is the big one. I'll stop talking. Ari, go ahead.
No, well, I was gonna say too, and like unironically, I guess, or ironically, we use the trauma-informed principles too, and we talk about approaching to de-escalation as a way of like, there's a lot of pre-crisis work that goes into it too, right? Like on how to avoid as much or set the stage as much, but then there are situations that are going to escalate. And I actually use an example of how I unwittingly or unknowingly created a situation worse before I helped make it better. Like I helped escalate because I used the wrong words, because it does really depend on the person. And the tenant is what we always talk about too, is there's some word, some words are more upsetting for folks than others. And so getting to know them and know what to use and what to avoid and what to say, what not to say is really important. But I think the key too that we always just remind people is having this trauma-informed approach or lens, knowing how to engage folks and building that trusting relationship is, you have the tools when you're in the moment. It feels like you don't, but you do. And so just it's relying on that. And I always give the example too of how I had to do some of that self-talk, thinking about Candy's remark too about not letting yourself escalate. And what Robert was saying is just the biggest advice I give folks too is just to wait and pause and don't feel like you need to jump in and say the perfect thing. When things start to escalate, sometimes people just need to cry. They need to yell. It's very uncomfortable, but being enough aware of yourself and your colleagues to know what's uncomfortable versus what starts to feel unsafe could kind of help dictate what the next step is. But I usually take advantage of that time to pause because I have to do a lot of self-talk to like talk myself down to make sure I'm not being triggered, but then also to try to think of what's that back pocket phrase I need to say next. But also listening to them, because a lot of what upsets people is feeling unheard, unseen, which you guys have all addressed already. So yeah. Sorry, I see two hands coming up. So,
oh yeah, sorry, I can stop talking. Go ahead.
I think it was Christina first.
Yes, Christina. I love your comment.
Hi. So I believe in the peer support and how some of my clients can, they're older. My caseload is mostly made up of elders. I'm not sure if that makes a difference at all, but a lot of them, when I bring up the idea of peer support, they're very resistant to it. Very resistant because they're like, well, what are they going to teach me that I don't already know if we did the same thing? So and it's not just peer support for like substance use or anything, but it's just the idea of being inside now and how different that is. And, there's almost like a grief, right? That happens when people are inside. They grieve being outside and what that life was, and what they know and how that's changed. So, I'll mention like peer support or participating in the building that they live in and these activities. And there's just a big resistance to it. So any ideas as to maybe it's my language, maybe it's the words that I'm using, because I'm like, hey, just somewhere that you could just kind of be with people, somewhere you could just kind of sit there and you could just be in the back. You don't have to participate. Anything like that would be really helpful, because there is definitely a sense of isolation for some of my clients, but there's a resistance in accepting a peer support or social circles. So, but maybe I just haven't tapped into what they're interested in. But any ideas would be appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah. I have some. Are you doing the wait for
we're
me?
We're doing that thing we do. Yes, Ari, go ahead, and then I'll perhaps go as well.
Well, because I was thinking, I was also thinking, I'm sure some folks have some stuff too. Yeah, natural supports. Yeah, I think some of it could be semantics, and some of it is just asking them what they want. Like, what are they looking for? What are some gaps or needs they have in their life, and trying to connect it to how a peer support environment or group could help. I've also rephrased it, like it sounded like you said too, but like something about like, do you see any benefits in just being in community with folks, and just sharing that space with folks? Or yeah, like JC saying community supports. And then I've also turned it to also say, like, you're right, there's probably not much people can teach you, but do you think it would be motivating, or you would find any strength or gaining in sharing your story with folks and helping other people learn, and kind of, because that's really what it is, right, with the peer support. So getting them to see that this is also an opportunity for them to share and mentorship, buddy systems. I don't know, it's like there's a million semantics I could think of, but I think also it probably is just tapping into something that sounds appealing to them. And sometimes we have to offer things 20 times, and it's the 21st where you're like, why didn't I say that the 5th time? But sometimes it's trial and error. Yeah.
The other things I'm thinking about are like a couple things that come to mind is when we mentioned like that someone said, I'm paraphrasing, but like, what can I learn? I've perhaps been through the same situation as one. Every situation is different, but two, like to almost flip this. And I don't know that I would recommend saying this if you really know the person well, but like, well, I haven't been through that. So what can you learn from me? Like, we're all here to learn from each other, right? Like, how do we broaden perspectives? How do we as humans in community, right? Like, we all have something to learn. We all have something to teach. So maybe this person might have a strategy that I haven't thought of. Maybe not only because they've been through it, but also just because they're a different person, like just expanding that, like those community supports that are being listed. And I had a different one, but now I'm blanking on what it was. Maybe it will come back. Yeah.
What you were saying too, Kate, was some word you used made me think of too, how feedback we get in training sometimes too, where folks feel like they just kind of need that place to feel validation and know that it's not just them that's struggling with this, or it's not just them that is seeking support or healing. So I think sometimes reminding them of that too, like what a space where you could feel you can commiserate, or your experiences can be validated through other people's experiences. Is there any benefit to that? Sometimes it's just asking the questions, but it is hard. Yeah.
I think also, I remember the other one that I think was Jamie's comment around, like, many of the folks who work in the field, perhaps some of you here today, have experienced homelessness or perhaps institutionalization, or have struggles with mental illness. Name your thing, right? Every person in the world has experienced trauma in some way or another. So I think a little bit about like, just acknowledging that with folks, not that everyone has to share their experiences, but just saying like, hey, a lot of us have had experiences that we may not be sharing. So just like it can, again, benefit to hear from other people, and you never know what experiences a person has had. And you might be able to share some of yours, but the other, and not kind of othering, is like, oh, and here's a peer support worker. It's like, no, here's an amazing equal member of the team who has a very unique skill set that you might benefit from, which makes me think a little bit about like the move-in process as well. And I'm not sure what the move-in process is, or like the team, or becoming, if it's an outreach worker, like part of the caseload onboarding sort of situation where you're at, but thinking about like, can you introduce or have someone have a meeting with a peer worker in the beginning, just to share a little bit about what they do, so they can ask that person directly who's working as a peer, to kind of, again, normalize, if you will, that that's an equal member of the team, and they provide a unique set of services just as you do. So yeah. And I see Wayne has their hand up too. Oops, sorry.
Yeah. No, I was just gonna say, and I want to highlight that JC and Debbie have some great ideas in the chat too. Yeah, but Wayne's been waiting patiently for a while.
So what I wanted to speak to is as someone who's formerly homeless myself, for the ACEs score provided a very quick shortcut into being able to relate to people without going into a bunch of detail. I can say, hey, I scored a 9. Okay, I know what you know, and if you're familiar with that, then you know where I'm coming from.
Yep.
My whole life is I've been called to this work. And it came out of how I was delivered from it myself. And I find that the most important thing that I can do in this work is self-care. My entire life revolves not around the work that I do, but around my spiritual, physical, mental, and emotional nourishment for what works for me. And I make that time foremost and central. And I'm fortunate to be able to work in an environment that supports that, because I can't give away what I don't have. And there are some days that I just don't have it to give, so that I think that's so important for, particularly for those of us that come from these places that are working in this area. And the second thing regarding the peer support, I think it's kind of an othering if you're working with folks that are coming, unhoused, remember that the primary survival characteristic is to be able to read you and to know if you're authentic or not, because my life might depend upon it, So introducing as a suggestion, just have those with the lived experience, the peer support, just be part of the team and don't even mention it, because it'll get communicated when it gets communicated through the process of developing sort of emotional connections between you. So that would be my suggestion.
I love that suggestion, Wayne. Yeah, thank you for that, and for sharing your story and being vulnerable. That's really appreciate
it.
That. It's really powerful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is it JC? I think is next.
Yes.
I just shared in the chat that you're just quickly, Wayne, your comment really brought home this quote that's like my new favorite that I share with everybody, which is about self-care. It's about creating a life you do not want to escape from. I just feel like how you phrased it too was beautiful too. It's about focusing on yourself, right? So you can give what you have. Okay, sorry, JC, go ahead.
Wayne, that was a beautiful share. Thank you very much. Being a cancer survivor, and I was working with my social worker, and because there's a habit of outcome driven work, right? All I really wanted her to do during my engagement with her was listen. She talked about all of the things that she wanted me to do. And I sat there in that room after I got my diagnosis, and she not once asked me how I felt or, where did I see myself? So listening is really a skill. And Wayne, thank you for you shared a part about self-care. That's really important, not just for the social worker or the case manager, but even for the person that you're engaging with.
Yeah.
But I didn't feel heard at all. And I did bring this to her, the care supervisor's attention, because, you're dealing with folks that have, again, trauma. But listening is a number one thing that's very important in this work, is because we're so outcome driven, or we want answers right away, or we need data right away. So I'm just, making a suggestion that, and I'm just sharing my lived experience, not just from homelessness and DV, but just when dealing with our folks, it should be a two-way conversation, not just one. So what I'm hearing you say, or, how are you feeling about this? I don't know, it just brewed in the pit of my belly about listening.
Yeah, I love that, JC. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I think as in this field, often there's this tendency to want to fix people, right? Or discomfort with folks having emotions or that, which could be a number of things. That could be a societal thing, but people aren't there to be fixed. So anyway, that just came up for me when you were talking to just that listening. I didn't ask you to fix things. I just want you to listen. I love that. That's a beautiful lesson. Yeah. Darlene, yeah, you had a comment as well. Your hand up.
Good morning. For me, experiencing homelessness and working and stuff, what came up for me to try is not bring it with me, because you still got to live on a day-to-day basis, and learning how to live and work through it, and don't pacify it. You know how people say, well, I gotta do this, I gotta do that, whining and whining and whining and whining and whining. Sometimes that makes your own mental health worse, because you're not helping yourself. You're getting it for me, I'm getting the services. I'm have a therapist. I have a great support group. It's just learning how to work through it. True is a challenge. True is a game changer. True, it's a lot of stuff under that umbrella. But learning how to use that umbrella at the right times when you're walking through the drops of life, and learning how to manage using it is one thing I've learned, and I'm still learning, because true, I'm settled, I'm comfortable, but I still have drops that I have to use my umbrella for, just to know how to prepare myself for the next one and to work through it. And like someone said, I think you just said it, Kate, always trying to fix somebody, always trying to fix somebody, but learning how to fix you and listening to you and working on you is something that we all have to work through and work with, because that is part of self-care. That is self-care. And having them tools, I mean, we have the tools. It's just that sometimes we don't want to use them because we got other stuff to do. But learning how to use it and making time, giving ourselves the right time and making ourselves take the time and appreciating our own values within ourselves is what we got to learn how to do on a day-to-day basis. So that's my affirmation for myself.
That's beautiful. Thank you, darling. And I just want to share too, because again, we didn't pay any of you all to like help us move these things along, but everything you just said was on the one slide that we wanted to add. So I really appreciate you saying all that. Because I think you're right. You know, what some people are saying in the chat too is like, we can't fix things, we can't avoid, there's so much in our lives we can't control, right? And as you said, there's going to be drops, there's going to be things that people face that's upsetting, you know, that act as triggers or stimulus that, you know, brings back these things we don't want to remember. But the idea is like, how do we build strengths? How do we remind ourselves and each other that we do have these strengths and resilience? And then how do we, you know, hopefully make the next blow or next drop, you know, feel a little less hurtful, right? Or at least be able to maintain that sense of hope through it all is really beautiful. So thank you for saying that. And that was like 2 of the 3 things, like one of the things we wanted to remind folks of, you know, so it's literally on this slide, right? That we wanted to remind ourselves we can't avoid it all. We can try to reduce it. We can try to build resiliency. And as you said, reduce the likelihood, right? By recognizing what is re-traumatizing for you, what can cause these, unknown or unwilling, you know, reminders, and figuring out how to avoid them or work through them is super important. Yeah, Ms. Kenny's saying everyone feels it differently. Everyone. So as we said, inner response is a normal response because it's normal for you, right? I mean, it's how your body, how your mind reacts, and that's all that matters. Yeah.
As I think about what Candy shared and what you just shared as well, Ari, around the question Jamie had around like de-escalation and like things to say, not say, just kind of working through that. I think about again, everyone sees and feels trauma differently, to quote Candy, and thinking about making sure folks talk about this, right, in team meetings, knowing, just giving yourself permission, as well as just having a culture where you're trauma informed with each other to kind of like step back and say like, you know what, today might not be my day, or like, wow, in working with Ari, like some things are really coming up with me, like I might need a little bit of a break from working with Ari, or like maybe stepping away from that meeting I'm having with Ari and just tapping out, right? And that's okay, getting that support, to have that self-compassion that, you know, Tanya mentioned, and the other great examples that are coming forward. So just, yeah, how do we really start within, and how do we give ourselves permission to just, be gentle with ourselves and with others?
Yeah. Thanks for saying that, Kate, too, because I was trying to remember who said it in the chat, talked about also talking about it as a team after an incident. Kate knows I'm very big on the debriefing, because I've learned so much through just debriefing different incidents and case conferencing, just how much I've learned from my colleagues, because I'm not a clinician, right? That's not my training, but I've learned so much who are, or through folks who've had lived experience or just different experiences, as we've been talking about, just what that means and how to debrief it. But like you said, Kate, that's where we learn some things. Like a colleague will say, I was actually getting really upset and I had no idea. And they're like, oh, well, when you start seeing me do this, I don't remember what it was, like sweating or something. It's like, now I know how to support this colleague better, right? So that they don't feel like they're on their own to deal with these situations. And I'm also a big advocate of tapping out. It's a sign of strength, recognizing like, you know what, I am not the right person to be here in this moment, or I am not the right person. And so calling in for help is super important for all the reasons you guys have all said. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, well, we brought it down to the last 6 minutes. I don't know if there's more questions, comments. This has been like my favorite part, this ending piece, to be honest with you all. It's great comments, great examples and suggestions. So appreciate you all, but we do have a couple more minutes if people have questions. We didn't get to.
Everyone gets to it too. Can we just speak or no, we can't speak?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, this is Site Supervisor Willie Vega from Concord. And I love this training, and I did a lot of this training with some coworkers for a few years. So it's one of the best things I've done. But I was gonna say, whether it's here, I also pastor a church. So whether it's here, whether it's pastoring, whether it's at home, what I've learned in life is that when you listen, and I mean really listen to someone, because they respect that and they know that you care, but also when you respond, if they're looking for response, I love to use this little phrase. You know, my experience in life has been, or my experience in that situation has been, because I noticed their guards are not up anymore. And I've worked with hundreds and thousands of people in the work that I do. And a lot of times when you share your experience, you know, in recovery, they say experience, strength, and hope. But it's really true that when you say my experience dealing with that, or my experience in whatever area that they're shedding light to, it kind of brings a calmness to everything, because they don't feel like you're judging them. They don't feel like you're analyzing them or being a therapist at the time. You're just listening and you're sharing yourself with them because you could relate. And I believe the words that we use are powerful. Even something as simple as my experience has been in whatever area it is that they're talking about. So I just wanted to share that with you. And I'm enjoying this meeting very much.
Thank you.
Absolutely, that's great. I love all these. I'm gonna like soak up all these pro tips and like practice them in my life. So I appreciate all these that folks are sharing. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, if you do anything in these past couple of minutes, would appreciate filling out the survey that Jamie posted, because yes, we do like to get feedback. Personally, Kate and I know really take those to heart and really try to improve. But also, I'm sure it would help Jamie and her team as well to understand what's needed next, how to keep this learning and growing, continuing as a community. I love that you all are doing this together. So thank you. Yeah, if anything else, just thank you. We know it's hard work. You guys have all demonstrated that you've been doing this work. You got expertise, you got experience and great perspectives. And so it's an honor to share the space with you all, and that you took time to share this wisdom with us. I really appreciate it too, because I know there's a million other things you could have done in this past 2 hours. So really appreciate that you chose to spend it here with us. So thank you.
This was a great training. Well, thank you so much. We will be following up with their slide deck, the recording, and another link to the survey in the next day or two. And also, you know, in the survey, it's going to ask you if there are more things that you want to know related to this topic or other topics similar to this. So please let us know. It helps us plan the kinds of trainings that will be useful for you. But Ariana and Kate, you guys were fantastic. And we will be in touch about future trainings for sure. And I think that's it for today. So folks are welcome to hang out here a little bit if you want to, but we're done. You are free.
For you to go and continue to do great work. Thank you all.